Welcome to Introduction to Oceanography. This is Chapter 12 from the Essentials of Oceanography, 7th edition by Tom Garrison. And we're finally going to talk a little bit about life in the ocean. All right, the main concepts from Chapter 12. All of Earth's life forms are related, meaning all of Earth's life forms have apparently evolved from a single ancient instant of origin. All life activity is involved, directly or indirectly, in energy transformation and transfer. Photosynthesis appears to be the dominant method of binding energy into carbohydrates on this planet, or at least at the Earth's surface. Primary productivity involves the synthesis of organic materials from inorganic substances by photosynthesis or by chemosynthesis. Primary productivity is expressed in grams of carbon bound into organic material per square meter of ocean surface area per year. The atoms and small molecules that make up the biochemicals and thus the bodies of organisms move between living and non-living realms in a biogeochemical cycle. An organism's success can be limited by inappropriate amounts of these materials. Another main concept from Chapter 12 is that evolution in fact happens. Organisms change as time passes, adapting by natural selection to their environments. And lastly, oceanic life is classified by evolutionary heritage and its location in the environment. All right, life, unity and diversity. The distinction between the living and non-living does not lie in composition or appearance, but in the ability of the living to manipulate energy. So non-living inanimate objects cannot manipulate energy, and living objects can manipulate energy. And also, both living and non-living objects are largely made up of the same materials, the same types of materials, just in different organizations. Living organisms all have the ability to capture, store, and transmit energy and have the ability to reproduce. All living organisms share the underlying mechanisms for capturing and storing energy, manufacturing proteins, and transmitting information between generations. Essentially, all life on Earth is the same, just composed differently. So there may be as much as 100 million different species of organisms on Earth. That's our diversity. On Earth, the same atoms, literally the same atoms, move continuously in and out of living and non-living systems. And the concept of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics tells us that things tend to move from an orderly state to a less orderly state. I always like to use the example of the lawnmower. A lawnmower bought brand new at Home Depot is very orderly and shiny, perhaps. That same lawnmower left out in the yard over weeks and months and years will become less and less orderly and eventually end up just as a pile of rust. The transformation of energy by living things allows temporary and local remission of the second law, as living things are places where the flow of energy results in increased order. So you can take energy and take a single atom or molecule and eventually end up with an entire human being. All living organisms are made up of 23 of the 107 known chemical elements. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen make up 99% of the mass of all living things. Essentially, all life on Earth is the same. It's just packaged differently. Atoms from these chemicals combine to form the classes of biological chemicals common to all life: carbohydrates, lipids, which is fats, waxes, oils, proteins, and nucleic acids, DNA. Despite there being 100 million species of organisms on Earth, there's essentially sameness in all living organisms with regards to the biological chemicals that make up all life. Unity, not diversity, truly is the central message of biology. This strongly suggests that all life is related by a common evolutionary history. All organisms have a common natural origin. So the concept of evolution helps explain the nature of life in the ocean. Natural selection. Two scientists, Darwin and Wallace, had a theory of evolution, thinking that mutation was an inheritable change in an organism's genes. There was a change in the genes, that was a mutation, and that change could be inherited from one organism to the next through reproduction. Adaptations are beneficial, inheritable, structural, or behavioral traits. Again, these are behavioral or structural traits, the structure of a creature, the behavior of a creature that are beneficial. These become inheritable. They can be passed down from one generation to the other, and those are adaptations. And a species is a group of actually or potentially interbreeding organisms, meaning if two animals cannot interbreed, they are not of the same species. Earth's organisms have changed or evolved over the course of 4 to 4.5 billion years. That evolution has occurred through the process of natural selection. Natural selection is when the environment favors individuals that are well adapted to the environment. The favorable traits of those individuals are retained because they are the individuals that can reproduce and contribute to successive generations. Darwin essentially has 5 main points. 1, that animals produce more offspring than can survive. 2, that there's competition for food. 3, that those best suited to their environment survive and pass on their genes to the next generation. 4, those unsuited for the environment do not pass on their genes, and over time the best suited animals, this is 5, outnumber the unsuited animals, and eventually the unsuited animals become extinct. So how do these adaptations, how do these animals become better suited to their environment? By mutation. So random variations or new traits are brought upon by genetic mutation, and not every variation or mutation is beneficial. Some animals maybe have mutations that are not beneficial and become extinct. Those mutations that are beneficial, a shape that allows a fish to swim more quickly to avoid a predator or catch food, those types of beneficial traits are then naturally selected over tremendously great spans of time. Organisms don't want to evolve. Organisms aren't trying to evolve. Organisms aren't thinking about better ways to be and therefore evolve. They don't want to evolve, and individuals do not evolve. I don't decide that if I was taller, I'd be a better basketball player and then evolve into a taller basketball player. Organisms evolve over time, and as those groups respond to environmental pressures. If environmental pressures push animals to be tall over great periods of time, they become taller. Now, there's another concept known as convergent evolution, and that occurs when animals of different species adapt to the same environmental pressures and take on similar characteristics. Like, what are 3 animals in the ocean that want to swim fast? Well, a penguin to avoid orcas, a shark to catch food, and a dolphin to catch food. You got a flightless bird, you have a fish, and a marine mammal, but they have all adapted to the same environmental pressures to take on similar characteristics, and that specifically is their shape. Convergent evolution, again, environmental conditions lead to similar adaptations in otherwise much different species. The environment isn't right for the organisms, rather the organisms become right for the environment. Now, there is a natural system of classification that is based on this common natural origin and then how animals evolve from that common natural origin. And it breaks different animals into several very large kingdoms and then hierarchies within those kingdoms. So the study of biological classifications is called taxonomy. The father of modern taxonomy here back in 1732. He invented the 3 supreme categories or kingdoms of animal, vegetable, or mineral. Now, today, biologists leave the mineral kingdom to geologists and have expanded the 2 kingdoms to 6 kingdoms. So his original theories are, well, you have animals, you have plants, and you have rocks, animal, mineral, or vegetable. Well, again, we don't consider anything inanimate to be part of the kingdoms of life, so we got rid of those, just animal and vegetable. And then biologists have come up with 4 other kingdoms to go within this hierarchy. But the great contribution was this system of classification based on a hierarchy, a grouping of objects by degrees of complexity, grade, or class. But again, all coming back to the idea that all organisms have a common natural origin. So here we have our kingdoms. We have the bacteria, the archaea, then the eukarya, the animals, the plants, and the protista. So a family tree showing the relationships of kingdoms presumably evolved from a distant common ancestor. So the earliest cells developed into bacteria, and then archaea, and then eukarya or eukaryotes, which is multi-cell, and then that developed into the animal and plant kingdom, and then also protista as well. So bacteria and archaea contain single cells without a nuclei or organelles. They have to split in order to reproduce. Collectively, they are the prokaryotes. They're the prokaryotes. The fungi, the protists, the animals, and plants contain organisms with cells having nuclei and organelles, which means they can reproduce. And collectively, they're known as eukaryotes. You got your prokaryotes and your eukaryotes. The prokaryotes are the single cell. The eukaryotes are the multi-cell. But again, the earliest cells are the common ancestor, and from that came our 6 kingdoms. How do all these 6 kingdoms move energy and mass through the system? Well, the main source of energy for living things on Earth, and all living things on Earth, is going to be the sun. Most of the energy used by marine organisms to make food comes from the sun. However, some food is made chemically. So you have 2 different ways of making food in the ocean, specifically photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process used by most producers, autotrophs, that means creatures that create their own food, to convert the sun's energy into food energy. Chemosynthesis is the production of organic compounds or food from inorganic molecules in the environment. Energy is released when the inorganic molecule is oxidized by certain organisms. So photosynthesis is pretty straightforward. You have 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 water molecules, and chlorophyll in plants takes sunlight and combines the carbon dioxide and water, and what you result in is glucose or carbohydrates and oxygen that plants give off. So where do we get oxygen? In the atmosphere or in the ocean? We get it from plants. As a matter of fact, the first atmosphere of the Earth, which was largely the result of outgassing from volcanic activity inside the molten Earth, had no oxygen at all. There was no oxygen. There's a lot of nitrous, there's a lot of methane, a lot of carbon dioxide, but there was no oxygen. And it took plants on Earth for the first oxygen molecules to be created through photosynthesis. So in photosynthesis, energy from sunlight is used to bond 6 separate carbon atoms derived from carbon dioxide into a single energy-rich 6-carbon molecule, the sugar glucose, or your carbohydrate. The pigment chlorophyll absorbs and briefly stores the light energy needed to drive this reaction. Water is broken down in the process, and oxygen is released. A form of chemosynthesis, and this is one form of chemosynthesis, 6 molecules of oxygen, 24 molecules of hydrogen sulfide to form glucose. Other products include 24 sulfur atoms and 18 water molecules. But the energy to bond carbon atoms into glucose comes from breaking the chemical bonds holding sulfur and hydrogen atoms together in the hydrogen sulfide. Bottom line is, chemosynthesis, that is about making carbohydrates through other chemical reactions. So, the flow of energy through living systems. At each step, energy is degraded. That is, it's transformed into a less useful form. Organisms release stored energy when they use food for growth, repair, movement, or reproduction. And if you think about it, those are the main, that is, components of what living things do. They grow, they repair, they move, and they reproduce. And of course, when I say repair, they repair their own bodies. Food ultimately breaks down into waste, or waste heat, that is lost into space. So you have sunlight that comes in, and the primary producers photosynthesize, green plants and algae, and some bacteria photosynthesize that sunlight into carbohydrates. And then consumers consume those carbohydrates. When a fish eats a plant, or when you eat some vegetables, you're consuming that primary producer. And so respirers, or animals, we take in oxygen, all right, and we use that oxygen, and we break that down. We break down the carbohydrates we take in to give us energy, and then the heat of our movement is waste, and that's what's lost to space, and that's where entropy comes into play. That starts out as light energy and ends up as waste heat energy, so it degrades throughout the entire process. All right, primary productivity. Primary productivity is the synthesis of organic material, carbohydrates, from inorganic molecules by photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Oceanic primary productivity, the incorporation of carbon atoms into carbohydrates, is measured in grams of carbon bound into carbohydrates per square meter of ocean surface per year. Phytoplankton, seaweeds, and chemosynthetic organisms make up the ocean's primary producers. Those are the plants that take in sunlight and make carbohydrates. The primary producer's mass is assumed to be about 10 times the mass of the carbon it is bound into carbohydrates. So 10 times the mass of primary producers to create 1 unit of the carbohydrates that they produce. So cycles between the organic and the inorganic operate more quickly in the ocean than on land. So this whole primary production happens much more quickly in the ocean. Plants and vegetables grow very slowly on land compared to what happens in the ocean. So you can see by this illustration, you have 1 square meter of ocean. That's at m squared in our little equation. Carbon dioxide and water and sunlight. You have a little diatom. So a diatom is a phytoplankton, and it produces the glucose. Typical oceanic primary productivity in this water column would bind 120 grams of carbon into molecules of glucose each year. So primary productivity is expressed in grams of carbon bound into organic material per square meter of ocean surface per year. Phytoplanktons, the product of 90 to 96% of the surface ocean's carbohydrates. So that's where most phytoplankton is, where most of the surface ocean's carbohydrates come from. It occurs in water, it occurs in seabed sediments, and actually can occur in solid rock as well. Now, there's a very small percentage known as extremophiles, or bacteria or archaea, that live under extreme conditions that also produce some of the carbohydrates as well. All right, so the chlorophyll concentration is a pretty good indication of where you have oceanic productivity. So oceanic productivity can be observed from a satellite. The satellite launched in 1997 to detect the amount of chlorophyll in the ocean surface water. Chlorophyll content allows an estimate of productivity. Red, yellow, and green areas indicate high primary productivity. Blue areas indicate low. So this image was derived from, it looks like back in 1997, September through August of 1998. So a pretty old image, but you can see where you have more productivity. If you look at land, where you have the Congo or where you have the Amazon, you have a lot of primary productivity. Sub-Saharan Africa, you have very little up there, and again, you can see the same thing in the ocean, where you have the blues and the yellows and the greens and the oranges. Food webs serve to disperse that energy. They take in sunlight and they move energy through the web. So autotrophs are the organisms that make their own food, also called the primary producers. They take in sunlight and turn carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates, and they respire oxygen. They give off oxygen. Heterotrophs are organisms that must consume other organisms. So heterotrophs are going to consume autotrophs, or they're going to consume other heterotrophs. They can't make their own energy. They got to consume something else for energy. So the trophic pyramid is a model that describes who eats whom. And we'll take a look at that trophic pyramid on the next slide. So there are lots of primary producers, more primary producers than anything else, both in mass and in numbers, and primary consumers eat primary producers. Secondary consumers up the trophic pyramid, and there are fewer of them, eat primary consumers, and the top of the trophic pyramid, the top consumers eat those secondary consumers. The mass of consumers becomes smaller as the energy travels to the top of the pyramid. Many smaller primary producers and few large top consumers. Now, only about 10% of the energy from the organisms consumed is stored in the consumer as flesh. So this is your trophic pyramid, with the primary producers being at the bottom of the pyramid and the numbers and the amount of mass getting smaller and smaller as you go up. So 10,000 kilograms of primary producers may net 1,000 kilograms of small herbivores and 100 kilograms of small fish, and perhaps 10 kilograms of medium-sized fish for each kilogram of tuna. And a tuna sandwich ends up being about 100 grams, that is, of tuna. So that's how your trophic pyramid works. Very, very large and broad at the bottom, very narrow and small at the top. So how many kilograms of primary producers are necessary to maintain 1 kilogram of tuna, a top carnivore? What is required for the average tuna sandwich? And so using this trophic pyramid model, you can see that about 1 kilogram of tuna, enough to make 10 quarter-pound tuna sandwiches, at the 5th trophic level is supported by 10 kilograms of mid-sized fish at the 4th, which is in turn supported by those 100 kilograms of small fish at the 3rd, who fed on 1,000 kilograms of zooplankton, the primary consumers at the 2nd, which have eaten 10,000 kilograms of phytoplankton, small autotrophs, primary producers at the 1st level. So the quarter-pound tuna sandwich has a long and also very energetic history. So food webs are designed to disperse energy. Real communities are more accurately described as a food web as opposed to that pyramid. In the real world, it's more of a web. And we have a simplified food web here illustrating the major trophic relationships leading to an adult blue whale, and then also the top carnivore, the killer whale. The arrows show the direction of energy flow. The numbers on each area represents the trophic level at which the organism is feeding. Diatoms and other primary producers convert the energy from the sun into food used by the rest of the oceanic community. So you have the primary producers, the photoautotrophs, the diatoms. They're taking sunlight, turning them into carbohydrates. And then your zooplankton, such as your primary consumers, your herbivores, they eat plants. And then consumers, primary consumers, eat those herbivores, and then secondary consumers, and so on and so on. So now we want to talk about the living and non-living cycle, and the fact that atoms and molecules that make up biochemical elements literally move between the living and non-living realms in what are known as biogeochemical cycles, essentially cycling in and out of living things, and in and out of rock, and in and out of ocean, and in and out of gases. Elements can exist, they're able to exist in massive reserves, also known as sinks. There's a massive amount of carbon dioxide in the ocean. There's massive amounts of carbon locked up in rocks, calcium carbonate, sedimentary rocks like limestone. So there are places where you have tremendous amounts of these elements, and they're known as sinks. So elements may exist in these sinks in the environment, or they can exist as part of living tissue. And there is a large-scale transport of these elements between the sinks and the living tissue. So elements move in and out of living tissue fairly rapidly, but those same elements can also be trapped in these sinks or in the earth or its environment for great, tremendous spans of geologic time. So some of the chemical elements that make up these biogeochemical cycles are carbon. Carbon is ubiquitous in the atmosphere. It is everywhere. It's present in all organic molecules. Because of its ability to form long chains which other atoms can attach, carbon is considered to be the main building block of life on Earth. Nitrogen is found in proteins and nucleic acids and is extremely important to life, but a very, very difficult, challenging element to get hold of. Phosphorus and silicon, they can be found in the rigid parts of organisms, shells perhaps. You can find them there, and you can also find them in teeth and bones and things of that nature. Iron and trace metals are used for electron transport, or helping to make those chemical reactions occur. So there's a number of different cycles we're going to take a look at. The first being the carbon cycle, and the carbon cycle is really, really quite complex. But it has a great deal to do with, or it can have a great deal to do with the global climate and increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, increasing temperatures, decreasing CO2 in the atmosphere, being locked up, let's say, in limestone or in the ocean can reduce the temperature in the atmosphere, and some global temperature fluctuations over great spans of geologic time are attributed to changes in carbon dioxide, or at least we can see a very clear correlation between the temperature and carbon dioxide. So the carbon cycle is in fact Earth's largest cycle. Carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater and is the source of the carbon atoms assembled into food by photosynthesis. So we take CO2, we take water, sunlight, and chlorophyll, and we make carbohydrates, and we give off oxygen. So those carbohydrates come from CO2 dissolved in seawater. When the food is metabolized, the CO2 is returned to the environment through respiration. All right? So when the food is eaten by a consumer that breathe in oxygen, then they exhale CO2. We take in food and we exhale CO2. Deer do it, fish do it. They take in oxygen differently than we do, but they take it into their gills, and CO2 comes out. So carbon dioxide is converted into bicarbonate ions, so it's changed, and then incorporated into the shells of marine organisms. So in the ocean, CO2 itself can become a bicarbonate ion, and then that can be used in the building of shells or corals or other different marine organisms. Now, when those organisms die, including corals, their shells can sink to the bottom of the ocean and then be compressed by more sediment on top of them, creating compression and what we call lithification, and turned into limestone. Now, that limestone may sit at the bottom of the seabed for hundreds of millions of years, or tectonics may actually force the limestone back to the surface, where once that limestone is exposed to the surface, erosion can then take that carbon back down into the ocean. It can return the carbon to the sea. So massive amounts of CO2 in the sea, that is, means that marine organisms never really have to suffer from a lack of CO2. Nitrogen, very interesting, as I said, tough to get hold of because it has to be fixed. As much nitrogen as there is in the atmosphere or even in the ocean, we can't use it in its current form. It has to be fixed. So the atmosphere is a vast reserve of nitrogen, but it cannot be assimilated by living organisms until it is fixed, meaning bound with oxygen and hydrogen, by bacteria. And usually it comes in the form of ammonia or nitrate ions. So nitrogen is an essential element in the construction of proteins and nucleic acids, as in DNA and RNA, and a few other critical biochemicals. So because nitrogen must be fixed, it is often very much a limiting factor for marine organisms. So upwelling from the deep ocean, where you tend to find lots of nitrogen because it dissolves well in cold water, upwelling can bring nitrogen up into the photic zone, where producers can incorporate it into essential molecules. Nitrogen from runoff, so nitrogen that comes from land, and that may be the result of fertilizers or nitrates found in decomposing animals or plant materials, that nitrogen can run off into the ocean, but more likely it's going to run off into coastal waters and feed plankton blooms. So we talk a lot about in Florida harmful algal blooms, harmful algae and plankton that bloom in our coastal waters and coastal waterways and estuaries and lagoons. It's largely a result of things like nitrogen and phosphorus running off into the water, creating lots and lots of a nutrient for the phytoplankton or the algal blooms to occur. There's also phosphorus and silicon cycles. Phosphorus is an essential part of the energy transporting compounds used by all of Earth's life forms. So phosphorus is very, very important. Phosphorus and silicon, those cycles operate in three very distinct loops, recycling at the surface on a daily time scale through feeding, death, and decay of organisms. So silicon and phosphorus is taken up by organisms, and as organisms die, the decomposition releases them. And then at longer time scales, as phosphorus and silica fall below the sinocline, or that level of cold water deep into the ocean, and then are only then upwelled hundreds of years later. But also, they can also be incorporated at geologic time scales when they get down to great depths, and through sedimentation, they are turned into some type of a rock and then only uplifted later because of tectonics. So three really distinct time frames and cycles for phosphorus and silicon. Much of the phosphorus-containing materials in the ocean does in fact fall to the seabed and is covered with sediment, seducted by tectonic forces, and really millions, tens, hundreds of millions of years later returns to the surface through volcanic eruptions. So we talked about these necessary elements, and these elements and other things are what are known as limiting factors, or they produce limitations on living organisms. A limiting factor is a factor found in the environment that can be harmful if it's present in quantities that are too large or too small. So any factor required for life can become a limiting factor. So what are the limiting factors for humans? Well, we need water. We need water, and then we need food. And so we also have to have temperatures at a certain level. Too cold, too hot, humans can't survive. So temperature, water, food, limiting factors. Any aspect of the physical environment that affects living organisms is a physical limiting factor, is a physical factor and a limiting factor. So what are the most important physical factors for marine organisms? Light, dissolved gases, temperature, salinity, the acid-base balance, so the ocean can't be too acidic, hydrostatic pressure, it can't be too much pressure, it can't be too little pressure, and of course food, nutrients. Those are all going to be your limiting factors. Biological factors, like physical factors, also have an effect on living organisms in the ocean. Some biologic factors that affect ocean organisms are feeding relationships, crowding, competition for space, or metabolic waste, or defense of the territory. Different biological factors that can have an effect on how easily it is for an organism to survive or live. All right, so light is one of those physical factors that's a limiting factor, and photosynthesis, as we know, depends on light. Most of the biological productivity of the ocean occurs in an area near the surface called the euphotic zone. That euphotic zone is very shallow, and that is where you're going to find most of the photosynthesis, most of the primary productivity, and again, you're going to find most of the light there. Below the euphotic zone is the dysphotic zone, and there's not enough light at all for primary production by photosynthesis. You have an imbalance. There's a lot of carbohydrates that are lost by respiration, but there's no photosynthesis. So plants cannot make as much energy in the daytime as it needs to live. So that dysphotic zone is a tough place for animals. There's enough light for vision, but not enough for photosynthesis. And below the dysphotic zone, you're going to have the aphotic zone, which is the vast bulk of the ocean where sunlight never reaches. So the euphotic zone statistic is for mid-latitude water average throughout the year. What they're showing you there, 70 meters or thereabouts. So that euphotic zone is going to be where you have most of your light, and that's where you have photosynthesis and vision. All right, temperature and metabolic rate. Daytime temperatures at the very top in some shallow tropical lagoons compared to temperatures at the deepest depths of the Antarctic basin. So an organism's metabolic rate, or the rate at which energy-releasing reactions proceed, increases with warmer temperatures. The warmer it is, the more reactions you're going to get. Ectothermic organisms have an internal temperature near that of their surroundings and are considered cold-blooded. Ectothermic organisms have a narrow possible temperature range that they can live in. They have got to have the temperature of the environment has to be the right temperature for their energy-releasing reactions. Snakes, when it gets very cold, slow down and can't move very fast because they are cold-blooded. They cannot regulate their own temperature. They have to have warm temperatures. Endothermic organisms maintain a stable internal body temperature. Endothermic organisms have a broader possible temperature range because they can adjust for cold or for hot. Complex animals that have a stable, high internal temperature are endothermic organisms, such as ourselves. Some isolated areas of the ocean around hydrothermal vents may be able to support a very specialized living organisms that temperatures around those hydrothermal vents up to about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. So those extremophiles live in those areas, but most creatures on Earth have to live in a much narrower temperature range. So again, you have very, very warm waters at the top of the ocean and very, very cold waters at the bottom. So metabolic rate increases with temperature. Ectothermic is cold-blooded, organisms with internal temperatures that stay very close to that of their surroundings, like most marine organisms. And endothermic, being warm-blooded, complex animals that have a stable, high internal temperature. So that's be mammals, birds, and some fishes. A few fishes are actually warm-blooded. So let's talk a little bit about how substances can move through cells. And they move through cells three different ways in diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Diffusion is the mixing due to the random molecular movements, and diffusion is something along the lines of a glass of clear, pure water. You put a tablespoon of salt in it, all the salt falls at the bottom, come back 2 days later, and all the salt will have dissolved, and the water will have an equal amount of salts throughout the entire glass of water. It will have moved through and mixed due to the random molecular movements. Osmosis is diffusion of water through a membrane. So you've got some membrane that is semi-permeable, meaning water can push through it, and water moves through that membrane. So an isotonic solution means there's the same concentration of dissolved substances that are inside and outside the organism. Just a couple of definitions here. An active transport is the transport of a substance against a concentration gradient, meaning you're pushing something against a concentration gradient, and it requires some kind of an energy input. So there's your example of diffusion. You got your dye cube and the glass of water, and give it 20 days, and it's going to have mixed through random molecular motions. Organisms in the ocean rely on these processes for lots of their life functions: diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So again, diffusion is going to be the mixing due to random molecular movements. Osmosis is going to be diffusion of water through a membrane, and then active transport is going to be the transport of a substance against a concentration gradient, requiring an energy input. So to the left, the effects of osmosis in different environments. So we talked about that isotonic at the previous slide. An isotonic solution contains the same concentration of dissolved solids, green, and water molecules, blue, as a cell. So if you look there at A, you've got a cell membrane, and you've got inside the cell and outside the cell, and they're the same amount of green dots and green circles and blue dots on either side. So an isotonic solution contains the same concentration of dissolved solids and water as the cell. Cells that are placed in isotonic solutions do not change in size, since there's no net movement of water. The water doesn't move one way or the other over the cell membrane. In a hypertonic solution, a hypertonic solution contains a higher concentration of dissolved solids than the cell does. So again, inside the cell, you have way more of the dissolved solids than you have outside the cell. So there's a gradient. There's more on the inside than there are on the outside. It's a gradient. There's more. There's a higher number inside, a lower number outside. And so think of the higher number being higher on a hill, the lower number being lower on the hill, and there's a downhill gradient. And so those dissolved solids want to move across that semi-permeable membrane, that cell membrane. They want to move through osmosis and create equilibrium. So the hypertonic solution wants to become isotonic. So a cell placed in a hypertonic solution, that is, a solution with less dissolved solids, will shrink as water moves out of the cell to the surrounding solution by osmosis. That water is going to move out of the cell. In a hypotonic solution, contains a lower dissolved solid concentration than the cell does, and a cell placed in a hypotonic solution will swell and rupture as water moves by osmosis from the environment into the cell. Again, it's going to move down the pressure gradient. It's going to move into the cell. The three main ways by which substances move into and out of cells: again, diffusion on the top, osmosis in the middle, and then through active transport, which is in the bottom. So again, in diffusion, molecules introduced into a container become evenly distributed after a period of time. In osmosis, the diffusion of water may cause a cell to swell. The blue dots represent water molecules, the red dots represent dissolved particles. And in both sides, left and right, there are 6 dissolved particles, but you can see that there's way more water on the outside. And so there's a gradient with more water on the outside than on the inside. And so the water moves across the cell membrane, and it causes that cell to swell. Now, if the gradient was opposite, then you would see that cell shrink, as we showed you on the previous slide. In active transport, it takes energy, and it allows a cell to accumulate molecules even when there are more inside the cell than outside the cell. So you can pump molecules into the cell. And then cells may also expel molecules by that very same process. Chapter 12 wraps up with a very brief discussion about mass extinction events. And mass extinction events are when a large group of one type of plant or animal disappears from the rock record, meaning looking at sedimentary rocks that create the rock record, going back in time in the layers. At some points in time, we see large populations of certain types of organisms, and then very suddenly in the rock record, those organisms disappear. And that we hypothesize to be because of a mass extinction event. The best known is the mass extinction event that occurred about 66 million years ago, or is hypothesized to have occurred, in which a large asteroid struck the Earth, resulting in the death of all the dinosaurs. In the rock record, we see lots of fossils of dinosaurs prior to 66 or so million years ago. Then suddenly we see no more dinosaurs at all, and then we begin to see in the rock record the rise of mammals. It is hypothesized that a large extinction event in the form of an asteroid striking the Earth caused all the dinosaurs to die off, and then mammals began to grow because of that. And one of the pieces of evidence, the observations we make to sort of lend credence to this hypothesis is the fact that in that same time period, 65 to 66 million years ago, there's a lot of iridium in the rock record. And iridium is an element that is scarce on Earth but plentiful in asteroids. And so that's part of that hypothesis. So your perspective on chapter 12 is that what we learned here is that atoms in living things are no different than the atoms in non-living things. As a matter of fact, the atoms go back and forth between the living and non-living in those large biogeochemical cycles. We also learned that the sun is the energy that powers all living things, and it's the same energy found in inanimate objects, that we can get that energy out of inanimate objects, we can get it from the sun. So one of the questions of this chapter is, how is it possible to distinguish between life and non-life? And of course we know that life can move, life can repair itself, and life can reproduce. And that's the difference, and it can create its own energy. So the discussion of life in this chapter highlights the highly organized nature of living material and the complex ways that living things manipulate matter and energy. So we know that life runs on food, and some of the world's most important producers of food are found in the ocean. And we have to understand this term, primary producer. It's central to this chapter. Primary indicates the food web starts with these organisms. Producer says that these organisms make the glucose, the carbohydrate, the all-important food molecule. Primary producers are organisms that synthesize energy-rich organic compounds from inorganic substances. So if someone asks you what is produced in a primary producer, the carbohydrate glucose. So marine life then depends on these primary producers, and largely the primary producers in all marine life depend on the ocean's chemical and physical composition. All right, the aspects of the physical and chemical ocean are these physical factors that we call limiting factors. All right, so we have transparency, the water's transparency, the temperature, the number of dissolved nutrients, the salinity, the types of dissolved gases, the acid-base balance, hydrostatic pressure. So all those physical factors have to be in place for life to thrive. Life and the ocean have evidently evolved together. Change in one is by change in the other, and the evolution of life on Earth and the scheme of natural classification that we use to organize it are very closely related. Our categorizations of living things are essentially based on their presumed ancestry and history. And again, evolution and natural selection tells us that everything comes from a joint ancestry. We all come from the original living entities on Earth. Then the chapter sort of rounds itself out with some conversations about osmosis and mass transport, and those things are important to understand as well. And this pretty much wraps up chapter 12 for an introduction to oceanography.